I think we are ready to commence, so I really appreciate your patience there this morning. Who knew there were so many different web technologies to allow us to communicate, and a new one very often. So I declare open this public meeting of the Senate Select Committee on Work and Care. This is a public hearing and a Hansard script of the proceedings is being made. And I begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of all the lands on which we meet, and they are many. And I pay my respects to elders past and present. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be participating in the hearing today. Today is the fourth of the committee's public hearings into work and care in Australia. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, you're protected by parliamentary privilege. It's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to this committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as a contempt. It's also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence. The committee generally prefers evidence to be given in public, but under the Senate's resolutions, witnesses have the right to request to be heard in private session. If a witness objects to answering a question, they should state the ground on which the objection is made, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer having regard to the ground on which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. I remind committee members and witnesses on video conference, if you could, to mute your microphones when you're not speaking. For the benefit of witnesses, the senators attending virtually today are myself, Barbara Pocock, Senator Deborah O'Neill. Good morning, Senator O'Neill.
Good morning.
And Senator Andrew Bragg. Good morning to you also. I now welcome with real pleasure members of the Australian Work and Family Policy Roundtable. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, would you please state your full names and the capacities in which you appear today?
Thank you, Senator Pocock. Would you like us to go around the room and do that?
Yes, Liz. Senator Hill, Associate Professor Hill, and would you throw to someone else and so on until we have everyone introduced? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Senator. So my name is Associate Professor Elizabeth Hill. I'm an Associate Professor in Political Economy at the University in Sydney and appear in my capacity as founder and co-convener of the Australian Work and Family Policy Roundtable. Alison.
And my name is Professor Alison Preston from the University of Western Australia, and I appear in my capacity as a member of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable.
Perhaps if we go to Professor Cass. You're muted.
Bettina, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, well, my name is Professor Emerita Bettina Cass, University of New South Wales, and I'm here today as a member of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable.
Lynn.
I'm delighted to be here.
I'm Lynn Craig. I'm a Professor of Sociology and Social Policy at the University of Melbourne, and I'm here in my capacity as a member of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable.
Kate.
Hello, I'm Associate Professor Kate Huppatz. I'm from Western Sydney University, and I'm here in my capacity as a member of the Work and Family Roundtable. Thank you.
Deb.
I'm Deb Brennan. I'm Professor Emerita at the University of New South Wales and appearing today as a member of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable.
Miranda.
Miranda Stewart. I'm a professor at the Law School at the University of Melbourne and honorary professor at the Crawford School of the Australian National University, but I'm appearing as a member of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable. So,
Good morning. My name is Meg Smith. I'm Associate Professor in the School of Business at Western Sydney University and appearing as a member of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable.
Morning, everyone. My name is Matt Withers. I'm a lecturer in sociology at the Australian National University, and I'm also appearing as a member of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable.
Myra.
I'm Associate Professor Myra Hamilton from the Centre of Excellence in Population Ageing Research at the University of Sydney, and I'm appearing today also as a member of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable.
Hi, I'm Natasha Cortis. I'm an Associate Professor of Social Policy at the Social Policy Research Centre, University of New South Wales, and I'm appearing here today also as a member of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable.
And Wendy.
Good morning. I'm Wendy Borg, Associate Professor in Early Childhood Education at Southern Cross University and appearing here as a member today of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable.
Everyone.
I think that's everybody. Have I got that right?
Yep.
Well, thank you so much to every one of you. I welcome you and the roundtable to this hearing. I'm very conscious of what your lives are like and how busy you all are, and I really appreciate, along with the other senators, the priority you have given to giving your evidence today. And I also want you to know that we are delighted to have a collection of our country's primary and foremost researchers on the terrain that this Senate committee is considering. I understand that you all have the information you need around parliamentary privilege. And Associate Professor Hill, would you like to begin by making an opening statement on behalf of the roundtable? And I understand we will then have 3 short statements from Professor Miranda Stewart, Associate Professor Myra Hamilton, and Dr. Matt Withers. Following that, I will then lead off with some questions and then invite committee deputy leader, and Deb O'Neill, to Senator O'Neill to follow me, and Senator Bragg after that, just so we all know the order in which things will unfold. So over to you, Senator, you, Dr. Hill. A lot of titles.
I know. Thanks so much, Senator Pocock. Thank you to you as chair and to senators of the committee for extending an invitation to the Australian Work and Family Policy Roundtable to appear at this public hearing. As I said, my name's Elizabeth Hill. I'm an Associate Professor in Political Economy at the University of Sydney and one of the founders and current co-conveners of the Roundtable. The Roundtable really appreciates the opportunity to speak to our submission and engage with the committee in a conversation about how to improve Australia's work care policy architecture and infrastructure. I'm joining the hearing from the University of Sydney, located on Gadigal land, and wish to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and to any other First Nations people on this call. And with me are 11 members of the Work and Family Policy Roundtable located at different universities around the country. And this is just a select group who were able to be present today. The Roundtable is a network of currently 35 academics from 18 universities and research institutions with specific expertise on work, care and family policy. The goal of the Roundtable is to propose, comment upon, collect and disseminate research to inform good evidence-based public policy in Australia. We held our first meeting in February 2005 and have been actively translating the research evidence into public policy and public debate for the past 17 years. As a group of Australia's leading academics, we research the full range of issues that make up our work care regime and policy architecture. You've already heard from Roundtable co-convener, distinguished RMIT Professor Sarah Charlesworth at the Melbourne hearing on September 20th, and Professor Marion Baird at the Sydney hearing on September 21st. You've also heard from the SDA, who addressed the findings of their recent report, Challenges of Work, Family and Care for Australia's Retail Workers, of which Roundtable member, Associate Professor Natasha Cortis, was the lead author. Roundtable members, Professor Alison Preston, Dr. Fiona McDonald, and again, Natasha Cortis, have also made individual submissions alongside our collective submission. So today we speak to our collective submission that draws together our research expertise on work and care and that of our Australian and international colleagues. Our submission is based primarily upon the research-informed recommendations contained in the 3 roundtable publications which we strongly recommend to the committee. They include the 2022 Federal Election Benchmarks for Work and Care, the 2019 Federal Election Benchmarks for Work and Care, and our 2020 publication on work and care in a gender-inclusive recovery, a bold policy agenda for a new social contract. These 3 documents provide an account of the inadequacy of Australia's work care regime pre-pandemic, the lessons that must be drawn from the pandemic experience for better work and care, and recommendations for an improved work care policy architecture. Each of these 3 documents include detailed recommendations on how to rebuild work care policy settings based around a new social contract between citizens, government and employers that recognises and supports the right for everyone to give and receive high quality care. The research evidence shows that care is the foundation of a good society and a dynamic and prosperous economy. High quality care, both paid and unpaid, enables the development of human capabilities, well-being and economic productivity. Whereas inadequate investment in care infrastructure, including both our services and workforce, weakens our economy, exacerbates inequalities and leaves communities vulnerable. We also strongly argue that care is a collective social responsibility and not the sole domain of women. Everyone has care needs and responsibilities, and these change over the life course. This means that good policy will take a life course approach to design and acknowledge Australians, all Australians, as worker carers or carer workers, but certainly not just workers and not just carers. This positioning and framing makes work care policy a complex domain. At any given point in time, some of us need paid leave from work in order to do unpaid care. Others need access to formal care services for their family so they can be relieved for some time of unpaid care and engage in the paid work that will allow them to build economic security. Good jobs, that is, those that are secure, properly paid and with predictable hours, all things that I know Professor Sarah Charlesworth spoke to you about, are absolutely fundamental here. Good care and good jobs go together. And now is the time for concrete action. The policy and regulatory settings are not fit for purpose, given the makeup of our labour market and the economic challenges Australia faces as we recover from the pandemic. Changing social norms, high levels of female education, demographic trends and economic conditions mean that Australian women are increasingly engaged in the labour market in a similar pattern to men. And here I want to just highlight a particular picture of this phenomenon. If you bear with me for a second. So this slide is from Professor Alison Preston's research on labour markets, and it shows the pattern of men and women's participation in paid work over the life course for both 2000 and 2019. So this is a pre-pandemic. And I want you just to note that this slide doesn't tell us anything about the type of work that men and women are doing. So it doesn't tell us anything about whether they're working in full-time or part-time work. It just tells us about their patterns of engagement in paid work over the life course. And the point I want to make with this slide is that there is growing convergence between the shape of men and women's labour force participation across the life course. So you can see here the blue and the red. These are men's patterns with not a lot of change here, except that older men are maintaining their commitment to the labour market for a little longer. Whereas women, we've got women in 2000 on the green line, and this, a lot of economists refer to this as kind of Nappy Valley, but we can see that Nappy Valley is flattening out and increasingly pushing up towards. There's still a participation gap, there's no doubt about that, and that's one of the important issues of this committee needs to address. But nevertheless, we are seeing a convergence in the shape of the pattern, and particularly with older women. You'll notice here that they are really engaging in paid work for a longer time over their life course. So I want to make the point about the convergence there in the pattern, but also to tell you that a range of qualitative and other quantitative research is showing us that young women expect long and fulfilling work lives in much the same way as men. And this is both the case, importantly, for both professional women, but also for frontline women working in essential jobs. So this is not just the domain of the highly educated professional knowledge sector workers. It is for all workers. This is a finding of our qualitative work. Our research also shows that young Australian men with children have similar understandings to young women about the types of care infrastructure that they will need to have a successful future of work. And that includes things like affordable and accessible early childhood education and care, adequate paid parental leave, and decent work with paid leave to care. So we're at a point where women are more than ever keen to participate in paid work, and men are increasingly signalling they want to participate in unpaid care. But all the data shows that gendered inequalities in paid and unpaid work remain deeply entrenched in Australian labour markets and our households. And Professor Lynn Craig can speak to the persistent gendered inequalities in unpaid labour in the home. These inequalities, we need to recognise, are not a reflection of personal choice. They are the direct consequences of our outdated, inadequate, and residual approach to work care policy architecture and the design of care systems that are not fit for purpose, are underfunded, and plagued by workforce crises on account of the systemic low wages paid to our mostly women care workers. So for Australia to reap the productivity benefits embedded in a female population that is amongst the best educated in the world, better educated than any time in history, and better educated than our male peers, we urgently need to update, upgrade, and upscale Australia's critical care infrastructure so that everyone, no matter where they live and what they do, are able to work and care in a way that they would like to most, unhampered by policy settings that distort the economic incentives for women and fail to provide the high quality and affordable care infrastructure that's essential for our 21st century economy and labour market. Many other countries do much better than us on many of these issues, and I know the committee has heard evidence on countries that have better designed paid parental leave and better designed early childhood education and care and long-term aged care systems. But just to remind the committee with regard to young children, recent OECD data shows Australia spends approximately 0.6% of GDP on education and care for children aged 0 to 5, compared to Iceland's 1.8% and an OECD average of about 0.7%. And when you consider all the public policy supports for young children in wealthy economies, UNICEF recently ranked Australia 37 out of 41 countries in terms of our total funding commitment. So our policy settings and our care systems need to be urgently recalibrated and resourced to build sustainable work, sustainable care, and a sustainable care workforce. This is not an easy task, and it will be costly. The depth of the research expertise on the roundtable shows that a piecemeal approach to work care policy is inadequate, and that success in this space will require a holistic and joined up approach to policy design. Funding this type of robust system will require an investment approach to work and care that is focused on the long-term benefits for individual and community well-being, social cohesion, economic productivity and prosperity. I now invite 3 of the roundtable members to make short statements on 3 specific areas of work care policy that we would like to highlight. Are you happy, Senator Pocock, for me to move to that?
Yes, go ahead. Thank you.
So can I first invite Professor Miranda Stewart?
Thanks very much. And can I check you can hear me okay?
Yes, it's excellent.
Thank you. A hotel room in Canberra, still here in Canberra on Ngunnawal land, and I'd like to acknowledge traditional owners here. So my area of specialisation is tax law and transfer law or policy. Transfers meaning cash payments. So you can think of it as cash in and cash out of government. And in particular, the interaction of these policy systems on decisions and effective tax rates on work. In particular, the gender impact of that when carers of children in particular are making choices to enter the workforce or not, and how much to work. So you've had the background of presence in the labour market of women and how that is changing over time. I think it's still important just to add to that background, and we do have a bit more information, I think, in general submission, that the statistic, the chart presented by Professor Hill was sort of participation as a whole over all women and men. So of sort of working age, I'm assuming that's right, that chart is of working age. And what we see is we do see a more substantial difference, in particular at child rearing, for women who are rearing children. So you saw in that chart that there was a dip, you know, the sort of the nappy dip, which is a dip at women's childbearing age, basically from kind of early 20s to 40s. But because that chart doesn't distinguish between families of women who have children and women who don't, it actually understates the impact on families with children. So just to kind of emphasise that a little further, I actually wanted to draw the committee's attention to an excellent article done by Patricia Apps, just published in the Australian Tax Forum in 2022, and I'm happy to share that article with the committee later. But Professor Apps does do an illustration of the life cycle phase using ABS data from 2015-16, so still a little bit out of date, and the time use data will, of course, hopefully give us more information, maybe not the first tranche this time, but in future. So I might just try and share what the chart from Patricia Apps's paper. I'm not sure if you can see that well enough. So the difference that is done here in Patricia's chart, and I do commend her work to the committee, potentially also evidence, but I can certainly share Professor App's work with you. She's done this work over a very long period of time, and it's really high quality and targeted to the issues the committee is considering. What this chart shows is actually working hours. So the other thing Professor Hill sort of commented was that was participation in the labour market, which could be anything from 1 hour a week to, you know, full time. This is male and female working hours, market hours is how Patricia Apps describes it, over different phases of the life course. And her sort of second phase is when you have young children in the household. And here you can see that men's hours are in grey, and they basically stay essentially full-time hours and be constant. So this is statistical data out of the population. And women's hours, of course, drop dramatically at that time. Women's hours do recover, not to the extent of men's hours. So these are women where there are children in the household. So the purpose of sharing that with you is just to kind of illustrate the very particular implications of the interaction of the tax and welfare system for families with children. So just a couple more things about that. I'm sure the committee is well aware of some of these issues, but I just wanted to emphasise them again. So there are three, let's say there are four elements to this interaction that I think are or should be of interest to the committee. The first is actually, of course, in the context where we're talking about people combining work and care. So we're talking about policy that is about families that do both things, but where we are increasingly seeing a move towards a dual earner or both partners wanting to work. The four things that are relevant are the rate structure itself and the income tax. How does that rate structure work? How progressive is that rate structure? The net childcare subsidy, as has been, well publicised, and we see continuing reform. The net childcare subsidy is a substantial subsidy, right? The government is paying substantial amounts to support the cost of childcare per hour per child, and that amount is being lifted in the latest government announced policy to sort of 95% of cost, a cap of 95%. But there are a couple of features of the design of that childcare subsidy which contribute to the sort of effective tax on work. The first is that it is income tested on joint income, so both primary earner and what we would call second earner. The second earner being the person joining the workforce and often with a lower wage and usually female. And it also it tapers. And it's tapers, but not on individual income, on joint income. So that childcare subsidy taper sits on top of the personal income tax rate structure and adds an effective tax rate. So just to be clear, you've got families that are receiving substantial subsidy or it's being paid to the childcare sector. That is, they have higher kind of income support, if you like, at their disposal. It's the withdrawal or tapering of that subsidy on joint income rather than individual worker income that has the effect of being a higher effective tax rate. Two other elements are family tax benefit A and family tax benefit B. And for sole-headed households, and we mustn't forget that that is about 20% of families with children are sole parent headed. The majority of those, I think about 90%, are female-headed households. So the withdrawal of all of these, family tax benefit A and B, family tax benefit A tapers at 20% to a threshold and then 30%. So you start to, over a threshold, you start earning income, you lose the transfer at 20 cents in the dollar, then 30 cents in the dollar. And family tax benefit A at 20 cents in the dollar. Over a different threshold. The thresholds are a little complex, so that's something to consider, and the payments are per child, so the effect differs depending on the number of children in the household. And because both of those payments for couple households are tested on joint income, again, we have a kind of quasi-joint or family unit in the transfer system, and that has the effect of the second earner's income is kind of on top of the first earner's income and faces, therefore, the higher rate. So the second earner is the more responsive, or we would say has more elastic labour supply, to be a bit more jargon oriented, and also at the same time faces that higher effective tax rate from withdrawal of benefits. So just a couple of illustrations. I will share with the committee these charts afterwards, and I don't want to take too much time now, so they are just illustrative. I have modelled, working with David Plunkett, who has a spreadsheet model of the tax and transfer system, what we would call the sort of daily effective tax rate for Cameo families. It's something that over the years, going back sort of 2016, 2018 and so on, we've modelled the different iterations of the childcare and family payments system. What we find is that as the childcare subsidy goes up, of course, effective tax rates do come down. So we are improving the situation for second earners, but we still face rather high effective tax rates on the second earner. So I just wanted to illustrate that for a couple of cameos. And I want to emphasise that these are cameos. So these are not real people using statistical data. These are hypothetical situations or hypothetical examples. I'm just going to try and share very quickly again a couple of these charts. So just to briefly, and the reason why I wanted to share these particular charts is because they demonstrate the interaction of the different kinds of family payment or different kind of childcare subsidy. And we can model this in slightly different ways if that would be of interest to the committee. So this is an example that's actually a sole parent example. I've started with the wrong thing. Let me move up my examples here. Let me give you an example here of a median wage family. So this is pretty low wage family. We would say median wage for the primary earner is that we've used the male median wage, which is $78,000 a year, based on ABS statistics. And then the female median wage is, of course, lower than that because we have a gender pay gap. What we have modelled is that the full-time earner is already working full-time, right? The primary earner is in the market working full-time. This household has 2 children under the age of 5. They are using long day childcare and paying for that and receiving the childcare subsidy. They are also receiving family tax benefit A and B. And what we model is what happens as our second earner, P2, goes to work 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week, 4 days a week, and 5 days a week. So as we kind of increase our hours, so rather than thinking per hour, what happens on the next hour, what we do is we say, well, more realistically, you work 2 days a week, or you work 3 days a week, or then you go back full time. What this shows, the bar chart shows on the y-axis the effective tax rate on that day of work. So if we have primary earner working full-time, second earner coming to work 1 day a week with 2 children under 5, in this scenario I've given you, we see an effective tax rate on her day of labour of 50%. That means that her take-home pay is only half the disposable income after we've adjusted for our tax and transfer settings. The disposable income is only half of the actual earnings for that day. What is that made up of? Well, blue here is family tax benefit A. So the first part, or quite a large chunk of this effective tax rate, if you like, is actually losing family tax benefit A. That's because of the tapering of that payment over a threshold. Remember, the primary earner is already earning income. The orange is losing family tax benefit B. So these are 2 payments with different thresholds and different tapering. You can see that the 2 of them actually comprise rather a lot of the effective tax rate on this median earner. The green is net childcare cost. So the childcare subsidy covers a lot of the childcare cost for this family, but not all of it. And this is the settings as they were in May 2022. So just to be clear, this does not take account of the proposed further changes that we will see. What you can see is day 2, we've got sort of 55%, day 3 again 50%, day 4 a little over 50%, and day 5 70% effective tax rate. So each day of work, essentially, we see you're only taking home the net difference. Income tax doesn't start kicking in until days 2, 3, 4, and 5. So, you know, on her first day of work, she pretty much pays no income tax, right? That 1 day a week of salary is not paying much tax. Of course, by the time you get to day 5, we're basically talking about net childcare cost is higher because we're losing the childcare subsidy and we're paying income tax. So look, Senator, I might pause there, and I'm not going to go through any other examples. I'm conscious of the time. But if there are any questions about the chart, I'm very happy to answer them now or just to submit this later for the committee.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Miranda. I'm just going to swap the order and invite Dr. Matt Withers to present next because he actually has to head off for teaching at 10 o'clock. So, Matt.
Liz, we can hardly hear you. Just give you that feedback.
Oh, is that better now?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So I was just going to say, sorry, we're going to swap the order and I'm going to invite Dr. Matt Withers to present now because he has to head off for teaching at 10 o'clock.
And we may follow Matt's presentation with any immediate questions in relation to immigration or migration. I understand that's what you're going to contribute on. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Senator Pocock and Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you all from the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and to pay my respects to elders past and present. Australia is a country of migrants, a large and increasing share of whom work and reside on temporary visas. Existing work and care policies, however, do not adequately address the needs and well-being of this diverse and important group of workers. Whether on permanent or temporary visas, migrant workers face specific challenges in meeting their work and care needs. We know that migrant workers are concentrated in lower paid occupations for which they are often overqualified, that the conditions attached to specific work visas heighten their vulnerability during employment, and that these same migration settings create significant obstacles to family reunification. As Professor Sarah Charlesworth's submission to this inquiry has detailed, migrant workers are overrepresented in devalued frontline care occupations, and it is grimly ironic that Australia's current migration setting frequently prevents these same workers from being able to receive and give care within their own families. Nowhere are these limitations on transnational family life more apparent than within the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme. The PALM scheme was designed to address rural and regional Australia's labour needs while promoting sustainable development outcomes in 9 Pacific Island countries and Timor-Leste. It offers Pacifica and Timorese workers employer-sponsored jobs for periods of up to 4 years, but currently offers no options for family accompaniment. My research into the implications of transnational family separation within the PALM scheme has involved in-depth interviews with migrant workers, their families, and government officials in Fiji, Samoa, Tonga, and Vanuatu. Findings are clear. The economic benefits of the scheme are substantial, but so too are the social costs borne by migrant households and their communities. Interviews with migrant workers and their families revealed that participation within the PALM scheme disrupted the care practices and personal relationships that had hitherto sustained their everyday lives. Parental bonds were frayed by the limitations of distance communication, important forms of unpaid household and community labour were displaced, and spousal relationships frequently broke down amid prolonged separation. These concerns were shared by representatives of Pacific Island country governments involved in administering the scheme. In a separate study commissioned by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, stakeholders conveyed significant and widespread concern about the frequency of extramarital affairs and the welfare of children separated from one or both parents, who were reported to experience harms ranging from dropping out of school through to instances of sexual abuse and abandonment. Consistent with the international literature on transnational family separation, it was clear that these outcomes were not gender neutral. Whether working in Australia or caring in their home countries, women and girls were observed to be more disadvantaged by the reconfigurations of transnational family life. These findings indicate that the PALM scheme is producing care deficits that erode the prospect of sustainable and gender equitable development for migrant workers, their families, and the communities they originate from. As one Fijian official remarked, these are not isolated cases, but in nearly every deployment there will be a family separation issue. As the current government looks to expand the PALM scheme as a labour supply fix for Australia's aged care system, the need for workplace and development policies that better support transnational family life and care practices are all the more urgent. Adopting decent care policies that involve families and pre-departure training, facilitate affordable family accompaniment and return travel options, and commit development spending to care infrastructure across the region would allow Australia to establish best practice in the fraught policy space of guest worker migration. And finally, in addition to this, I just want to emphasize that in administering a 4-year temporary migration scheme in which workers have no pathway to permanent residency, are unable to change jobs, and cannot be accompanied by family members, Australia has no policy equivalents in Europe and in North America. The closest policy approximations of the PALM scheme are to be found in the countries of the Persian Gulf, in Hong Kong, in Singapore and Malaysia, where exploitation is rife but unaccompanied by any pretense of development. The PALM scheme does offer better labour standards than the low bar set in those contexts, but it falls short in care policy. Existing plans to introduce family accompaniment within the scheme are riddled with caveats that will prevent workers from accessing the policy option. They will require permission from their employer for their families to join them. They must cover all the associated costs while on post-tax annual salaries of roughly $35,000 a year, and will not have subsidised access to public health and education services, the costs of which will vary substantially from state to state. And so I want to end by saying that there is a very real risk that the costs of family accompaniment will be so high within the existing model so as to make this an unviable option for most participants and their families. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Withers. Thank you for bringing our attention to an issue which has not come to our the committee previously. I'll ask a couple of questions and then invite Deputy Chair Senator O'Neill to see if she has any, and similarly Senator Bragg. How many people, I just wanted to ask first, are within the PALM scheme? How big is it?
So as of last available figures, the PALM scheme covers roughly 26,000 workers in Australia.
Who are here at present?
At present, yes. And roughly double that number who've been screened for pre-approval to participate in the scheme.
Okay, right. And do you have reports or data that you've referred to that you could supply to the committee that spell out comparable arrangements in other countries that you've referred to, and to the implications and consequences of the failure to provide family reunion? And that's essentially what you're pointing to as a recommendation, a more eased form of family reunion and more flexibility for the worker in the labour market to be able to leave their initial job. Are these the recommendations you're pointing to, essentially?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, to have ability to change employer over the duration of that stint of migration in Australia, but also a range of accompanying decent care policies that enable migrant workers to better access the care resources that they need, whether that means facilitating transnational care practices or directly investing in the care capacity of countries of origin in the Pacific and in Timor-Leste.
Thank you, Dr. Withers. Senator O'Neill, is there any questions you would like to ask of this witness who needs to go fairly soon?
Thank you very much, Mr. Withers. Do you have a good schema of exactly where these guest workers, as you've described them, are distributed across the country? That would be helpful just to sort of get a heat map of where it's really happening. And my other question is, what is the comparison in Europe? Like what conditions are we talking about for European countries that we would normally associate ourselves with in the OECD, for example, with regard to public policy?
Yeah, look, certainly. So I can answer both of those questions. The first, and one of the problems with the PALM scheme, is that the workers are effectively restricted to employment in rural and regional locations. At the present moment, workers are effectively working in over 100 different locations across Australia in every state, in often very remote communities. So there is no hotspot, so to speak. It's a very scattered program in terms of where workers are deployed. And workers have very little say in where they find employment as well, from the recruitment side of the program.
And this is actually one of the schemes where we have a much better idea of where the workers are than other schemes where we have workers who are completely unknown. Sort of, we've heard from the Fair Work Ombudsman and Fair Work commissioners that there are many workers who are not documented, up to over 100,000 people just moving around in the community who are completely unknown. They would be even more vulnerable than the group that you're describing.
Quite possibly, yes. Although I think one of the sort of distinctions here is that, yes, it's a highly sort of regimented program where we do have a sort of very good idea of where workers are located, although so-called absconsion from the program has increased dramatically in recent months and years. So it's actually sort of feeding into a lot of the kinds of undocumented migration that you're referring to.
Okay, thank you. And the second was the OECD.
Yeah, so the point I made in terms of comparison here is that there really is no sort of policy equivalent in a sort of scheme of this kind. Europe actually abandoned most of its guest worker schemes of this nature in the 1970s. And there hasn't been a sort of effort in Europe to return to this model, largely because of the contradictions it presents in terms of trying to have workers stay in a sort of permanently temporary capacity without having the same rights and access to family accompaniment, which is why I tried to draw attention to the fact that really the only sort of equivalent policies are to be found in much more sort of regimented authoritarian settings.
Can I ask one follow-up on that? Is in terms of the things that you described, no job change, no pathway to permanent migration, and no family accompaniment, which of those three things would be the priority in terms of changing the dynamic to approach, what you think might be the best practice?
From my standpoint, I think family accompaniment is really the sort of biggest issue in the scheme. And from speaking to workers, that's the issue which is most readily spoken about. Second to that, I think having the ability to change employer is a really important right that workers need to have access to.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Senator Bragg.
Oh, yeah, thanks. I've just got questions for Dr. Stewart.
So let's come back to that after we've heard from Associate Professor Hamilton. Okay, and I welcome Senator White, who's just joined us as well. So let's go. Is it okay if we go now? Thank you, Dr. Withers, for your time this morning. And if there's further material you have that relates to what you've put to us, we would welcome receiving it.
Yeah, I'd be very happy to submit that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Associate Professor Hamilton, we can go to you and then we'll come back and ask questions of all the previous presentations.
Thank you, Senator Pocock, and I'd like to acknowledge the Wongal people on whose land I'm speaking to you from today. I've prepared a short statement on work and care among grandparents. Grandparents providing regular care for grandchildren are an often invisible part of the work care equation in Australia, but care is highly prevalent in Australia. In 2017, about 860,000 children aged 0 to 12 received care from a grandparent in a typical week. Recent research by the Australian Institute of Family Studies has found that a quarter of grandparents of children aged 0 to 13 provided childcare at least once a week. Most of this care is provided by grandmothers. Most grandparents report providing this care to support their daughters and daughters-in-law to participate in paid work. And the most common reason cited for their adult children's need for help is barriers in the formal early childhood education and care market. It's too expensive, there isn't a place available nearby, it's not flexible enough, or it doesn't meet their needs in some other way. This certainly supports mothers to participate in paid work. There's now a substantial body of international evidence revealing that the availability of grandparent childcare boosts maternal labour supply. But it can create knock-on effects for the work care reconciliation of grandparents. While regular care of grandchildren can have benefits for grandparents, it can also have negative effects on their labour market participation, as they too experience challenges balancing paid work and childcare. In our research that surveyed grandparents with regular childcare responsibilities, 70% of grandparents changed their shifts, more than half reduced their hours, and 1 in 5 changed their jobs to accommodate their care responsibilities. More than 40% reported that it was difficult to balance work and caring for their grandchild. International research drawing on large-scale data also finds a relationship between grandparenthood and grandparent childcare and labour market withdrawal. Regular grandparent childcare can also have negative implications for grandparents' financial security as they reduce their incomes and retirement incomes by reducing their paid work and often increase their expenses because of the costs of caring for young children. Our research has suggested a tipping point of 13 hours of childcare per week beyond which grandparents start to report the negative effects of their childcare on their paid work, their incomes, and even their health. While some grandparent childcare is generally very positive for all involved, it's these more intensive levels of childcare that can be detrimental. According to recent AFES research, about half of grandparents who provide regular childcare provide 10 hours a week or more, and 1 in 5 provide 20 hours a week or more, so really getting into those very intensive levels. But research suggests that policies make a difference in increasing or reducing the levels of intensive grandparent childcare that are more likely to lead to negative outcomes. Countries with widely available and affordable ECEC, such as the Northern European countries, have much lower rates of intensive grandparent childcare and higher rates of mature age labour market participation among women. Grandparent childcare is still prevalent in these countries, but it's more occasional and doesn't interfere as much with grandparents' paid work. Longer parental leaves and access to part-time work for mothers also reduce these intensive levels of grandparent care. Countries with longer parental leaves tend to have lower rates of intensive grandparent childcare in the early months and years of a grandchild's life, when childcare can be very demanding and interfere heavily with paid work. Countries with poorer access to part-time work for mothers also tend to see high levels of intensive grandparent care because mothers who do work full-time. In contrast, policies that encourage working longer are likely to lead to a decrease in those intensive levels of grandparent childcare as more grandparents participate in paid work for longer. But grandparents are still likely to continue providing some childcare, particularly where they have access to part-time work. So it's likely that more grandparents will be combining work and care into the future. But our recent research suggests that many mature workers don't enjoy the same kind of access to work-care reconciliation policies as parents of young children do. Grandparents have reported to us that employer flexibility and understanding is essential for them to be able to successfully balance work and care. Some other countries are introducing policies that mitigate the impacts of childcare on grandparents' work and incomes and support them to combine work, childcare, and their other care responsibilities, such as those for ageing parents. Policies include grandparent leaves, longer carer leaves, a right to request based on grandparent childcare responsibilities, greater access to flexibility and part-time work among mature age workers, and credits to pension accounts while providing regular childcare. Finally, migrant families are among those most poorly serviced by the formal ECEC system, yet often have limited access to grandparent childcare because the grandparents live abroad. In these families, they're forced to rely on parent visas, one of which has a 30+ year waiting period, and the other of which is over $50,000 per parent, or recurring short-term visitor visas, which don't create the continuity of care required for parents to find ongoing, secure paid work. The recent introduction of the long stay parent visa was meant to counter this somewhat, but it remains expensive. It's $5,000 to $10,000 per parent, and it creates the conditions of that highly intensive childcare by grandparents that comes with negative impacts that I discussed above. The grandparents on the visa have no access to health and social rights, no access to work rights, no pathways to permanency, and the visa comes to an abrupt end after 5 or 10 years, depending on what you apply for, and then the parents must return to their country of origin. So in the area of work and care, I suggest the committee explicitly consider the role of grandparent childcare, the importance of supporting work-care reconciliation of mature workers, as well as parents of young children, and use an intergenerational lens in the consideration of policy in order to understand the likely effects across multiple generations beyond the household or nuclear family. Thanks.
Thank you, Associate Professor Hamilton. That's important evidence for our committee, and it's an area that we've had limited evidence on. So much appreciated. And once again, if you have any further documentation on the issues that you have put before us, we'd like to receive it. And thank you for your explicit pointing to a range of possible recommendations that we can consider. I'm very conscious our time is short, and I feel that you've put before us a strong argument for a coherent over investment across a holistic joined up work care system. That's what I very strongly heard from you, Associate Professor Hill, a comprehensive approach. I'm very conscious also that we've got new evidence before us in a range of areas, and I just want to pursue the tax and payments system, and Senator Bragg has a few questions for you, Professor Stewart. So over to you, Senator Bragg.
Oh, thanks very much. Thank you, Chair. Dr. Stewart, I just wanted to try and get a sense from you about what would be the most immediate policy changes we could make on the payment side to address that issue you identified of the effective marginal tax rate being so high for the secondary earner. I have to admit it was a bit hard to follow it on the phone. I know you had charts there, but what are the policy options that we could deploy to address that?
Okay, thanks for the question. Because there are all these elements in play at the same time, there's actually quite a lot of policy levers. The well-known one is the childcare subsidy and changing the adequacy of that and the taper rate, that is the income testing of that. And we are moving gradually towards something that is, the end of the spectrum for free payment. And we're sort of moving along that spectrum. The closer we move towards universalism, as long as we solve the other issues that are in the submission and by other experts about access, availability, suitable payment of care workers so that we have enough of them, and ease of use and appropriateness, right? So there's a lot of other pieces in that puzzle. Then we are improving the situation. So the additional element that I think has not really been in the policy space for quite some time is the family tax benefit AMB design. And these two payments have a long history. Many in the room know what that history is, going back to the 90s, but of course child allowances earlier. So what I would be advocating, without recommending any one particular solution here, I have a kind of intuitive preference, but what I would be recommending actually is a government review of the design of our family and child payment system, and considering in that review how that interacts with the tax rate structure and the childcare system that we've already talked about. The solution that would lower the effective tax rates, so the kinds of changes that would have that positive result include testing the payment on individual wage earnings of the second earner instead of on joint income. So instead of on both male and, the two people in the household. That poses some design challenges because you have to identify that person, identify their wage, but that's one approach. And the other possible approach is lowering the taper and raising the threshold at which the taper starts to kick in. And in particular for middle income households, low to middle, they are seeing the cutout happening precisely when that second earner increases her hours from sort of 1 to 2 up to 4 to 5. And that's where we want the policy impact. We want to increase hours of participation. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so I understand that you want to have a review, but maybe on notice, I'm just conscious that there's lots of other people who want to talk, so I won't take any more time, but perhaps on notice, and I'll send through something through the Secretariat, if you could just give us some options around the FBT issues without sort of nailing all your colours to the mast. I think that would be helpful. because, we have lots of reviews and inquiries into these things, and sometimes it's better to start with a bit of a concept, even if it's a bit of a woolly concept, just so we can sort of probe into that issue a bit deeper, okay?
No, that makes sense. I can certainly do that. Just one more comment on that, Senator.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm conscious of your time.
That's all right.
The challenge in the family tax bill, the policy challenge that the government needs to grapple with, is about poverty and inequality. The challenge is balancing adequate payments to low-income families, in particular sole parent-headed families, and a more universal child allowance that would also go kind of to most families, I would say. So, you've got fiscal cost issues there, but you've also got to make sure that in a policy reform, you do not reduce the benefits going to the poorest families. That's the challenge.
Well, I mean, can I just, in terms of what you come back with on that second issue of considering whether you could undertake an individual assessment rather than a family assessment of these matters, could you also consider any integrity measures that may be required if that system was to be considered?
Sure. Yes, I'll have a think about that and send in a short note.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you, Senator Bragg. And I'm with you in asking Professor Stewart to come back with, as far as you feel confident based on your research evidence and that of Professor Apps as well. I mean, we can always recommend an inquiry, further work and so on. But if there is evidence in favour of change that is more specific, that we can consider more immediately, that would be very welcome for us to consider.
Senator Pocock, can I just extend an invitation to Professor Emerita Cass and Brennan? They may also have some comments on this issue, particularly around with that long history of engagement in this space. Bettina or Deb, would either of you like to contribute to this question?
Certainly. The issue that Professor Stewart raised, which I think is quite crucial in terms of the family tax benefit payments, is that they constitute a high proportion of the incomes of low-income families. Then we should not consider them as add-ons. They are absolutely critical in some instances, and particularly for sole parent families and low-income couple families. And therefore, there can be a trade-off, a real dilemma between ensuring the adequacy of those payments and the relationship between the cut-off points and the tapers. I think that if the issue for government is ensuring the well-being of low-income families, both their employment potential and their care potential, and the welfare and well-being of their children, then I'd be putting my emphasis, I'm not saying that the Work and Family Policy Roundtable might, but I'd be putting mine on adequacy, because it's just so crucial. Very often, payments A and B, family payments A and B, are the crucial add-ons to job seeker, particularly for sole parents whose youngest child is over 8, and also for low-income parents whose youngest child, low-income couples whose youngest child is even younger than 8. And therefore, we should be ensuring that that balance works. And I'm sure Professor Stewart could work that out. Thank you.
Deb, would you like to make a contribution?
Thank you. I'll just make a very brief comment. I think that Professor Stewart has really taken us to the heart of the complexity of this issue of engaging in paid work, having access to childcare, and Professor Cass's comments extend that, of course. I really think I just want to make one brief point, which is there's a very strong focus at the moment on reducing the cost of childcare to families, and the roundtable very much welcomes that focus. However, and I think our whole submission drives this point home, the interconnectedness of the policy domains around, in this case, I'll just say the care of children. Reducing the cost to families is absolutely vital for women being able to increase their employment. However, we can't take our sights off the necessity of providing decent employment to the educators and teachers in this realm, and also providing the high quality service to children. And I know that nothing in the comments of my colleagues have suggested that, but I think it is really important to keep our eyes on the connectedness of the issues in this area.
Thank you, Professor Brennan. Senator O'Neill.
Thank you very much, Chair. I wonder if you might have any fiscal management, really, Professor Stewart, around what your ideal model would look like and where you think costs could be shifted in a way to deliver a more equitable outcome from the current budgetary envelope.
Simple question.
I think that's the Expenditure Review Committee, isn't it, in reality? So obviously, if you work within the current fiscal envelope of the current social security system, includes, New Start, the pension and family payments, you're going to struggle, right? So I would urge the committee, and I think it's in line with the comments of the roundtable as a whole, which are about the interconnectedness of these different policy fields and the impacts that are impacts not just on poverty relief, that's one thing, and that's part of the job of our Human Services and Social Security branch of government, but they have impacts across the economy, right, and across households, consumption and participation. So I would actually urge the committee to look beyond the fiscal envelope that we sit in social security. I do understand the fiscal constraints of government. We're very well aware of that. But in my view, it actually is misguided economic policy to constrain ourselves with this sort of artificial iron triangle, you could call it. It is worth the investment in spending more on our childcare provision, whether that's allowances in the home for some families as needed, paid parental leave, and the subsidy for shared collective care. It is worth the investment as a part of work and economic participation policy. So any of these policies that I would advocate are, of course, going to expand the immediate fiscal cost of these payments. I think we have to be clear about that. On the other side, of course, the tax rate structure as currently proposed, and then under the tax cuts projected to come in 24-25 does nothing. Those tax cuts do nothing or very little to encourage women's workforce participation, and they are inadequate. They would only make a very minor dent in the effective tax rates paid by families with children. A much better policy would be to reorient the resources dedicated to the tax cuts towards better policies for families with children.
Chair, can I make a short comment here also in response to Senator O'Neill's question? And that is just to say that part of the roundtable's evidence and a long conversation over 17 years has not only been to point to the joined up approach to policy, to effective policy, but also to recasting any expenditure as an investment. And seeing the links between the micro level changes at the household and individual in terms of participation and opportunities for work and care, and the way in which they then map onto changes in the macroeconomy and producing the kind of sustainable revenue base for additional revenue. And we certainly can see there's a lot of colleagues and a lot of research institutes within Australia that have been increasingly modelling these changes, and we see these come out all the time, both at the global level but also at the Australian level. So we've had multiple modellings by institutes like the Grattan Institute about the increase to GDP, to productivity, to prosperity of a certain investment in childcare, for example. And we've seen the industry super. They have also modelled increased investment in early childhood education and care and the impact that that will have on the retirement savings of women in median income jobs. We've had modelling, both international modelling and Australian modelling on the employment multiplier effect of investment in care sectors versus, other male-dominated sectors. That looks in terms of total employment, it's about twice as the proportion of employment is about twice that in the care sectors compared to the non-care sectors of a 1% increase in GDP, according to our colleagues, Sue Himmelweit and others. So there's actually an increased amount of modelling that really helps us understand the long-term cumulative impact on social and economic multipliers that are both operate at the micro level of the household and individual, but also at the macro economy. And I think that's certainly a position of the roundtable, that an investment approach allows us to better understand what the impact of that cost is, and also helps us to ask the question of, what is the cost of not acting? What are the impacts on productivity, on labour supply, on well-being, on social inclusion, on poverty, on inequality, of not investing quite in a determined and robust manner in a joined-up approach to work and care policy. So there's also that way of thinking about it.
So can I indicate that my colleague Amanda Rishworth took an incredible package to the Labor Party in the lead up to the last election, and the changes that are coming to pass are exactly based on the sort of modelling that you've been talking about. But this is a fantastic committee to be part of, and I absolutely agree with you about what investment does. And I think back to, my own life as an educator. Once upon a time there was no public education. We figured out it was a great idea to invest in our people, and we have education in the public sense in the widest possible way, because it is an investment that has a long-term benefit. At the same time, there are so many other committees that I'm on, just as one senator, where an investment approach is also being advocated. The reality is we do have to manage with what we have in the best possible way. So my question again is to think about what is in, not the envelope under the previous government, because that has significantly shifted with policy announcements and fiscal changes to investment in childcare. In this new environment, where do you see opportunities to maximise the benefit of that investment of your dollars, my dollars, Australia's dollars, with a sense of the future that would give rise to the best possible outcomes? So we can all want more, and I'm sure I'm with you in saying we would love to reshape this, but we are at a historical moment where there are things in train. People are living their lives, sometimes very difficultly managing with family tax benefit A and B, and trying to manage with a workforce participant, who's not helping them actually advance. There's so many complex stories out there. I'm keen that we get a sense from you as policy experts with 35 of the brightest people around the country. What does the best investment look like with the parts that we have to move? Because investment's long-term, but also government planning needs to be in the medium to longer term, rather than like tomorrow, let's just change this. And trading one thing off against the other, it's a simple answer, but it doesn't answer the complex questions that you're asking. Can I go to the issue of small business? We've seen a massive rise in the number of people getting an ABN or an ACN, and a significant rise in the number of women who are shifting out of paid work where they are a salary earner into often very insecure work as a contractor, but some are establishing their own small businesses and employing women in a very different model of employment that reveals a deeper understanding of care and the benefit of long-term employment, managing all those responsibilities because they have the cultural knowledge to do that. So I'm just wondering if there is any evidence about women in small business and how they are managing the care responsibilities, how the workforces that they are generating as new entrepreneurs coming into the workplace are dealing with these issues. And the other side of that is larger businesses and larger industries are now under some considerable pressure because of the new government's demands of reveal of pay equity, etc. But small businesses, which operate in quite a different way and need a lot of flexibility, what's your sense of their response to a shift in understanding about the responsibilities of care and managing their workforce when they might be like a micro business with 2 employees?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. Lynn, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I'd like to make the point that a lot of women become self-employed in order to be able to manage their own work and care responsibilities and are often sole traders, in fact, and that this is a risk they're taking often because the institutional supports from organisations are not adequate for them. So they're dealing with a care crisis by multitasking in a way if the children are a certain age and working around the children much more flexibly over the day and time, and maybe employing one other person who's doing a similar thing. But it goes to the difficulty of women working, being unable to predict necessarily what work they will be getting in a work environment where shifts are not predictable and pay is not adequate. A lot of the unemployment, the self-employment that is occurring is women taking that risk on themselves and trying to manage. So it's not necessarily that they're able to deal with it any better. It's that they are doing what they can in a very inflexible work environment. And I just like to echo what Myra said earlier, Professor Hamilton, Associate Professor Hamilton, about grandparents being so involved. And it's largely because of all the systems, the joined-up systems that we're mentioning, they are one point of flexibility. Workplaces are generally not flexible in favour of the worker, and childcare, formal childcare is not able to be very flexible as to which days you're going to use for your care and that sort of thing. But grandparents can do that. So I think to add to the complexity rather than to answer your question with a solution is that the labour market really needs to be attended to. A lot of the problem is long hours and multiple jobs, so that people, if families are not making enough money, they're taking on extra work. So the getting women into the workforce and participation is obviously a good goal and a good investment, but if it comes at the cost of extra hours, both in their own unpaid care work and in the labour market with dual earner families supplying more labour to the market at greater stress and inability to fit care around that, then there's a social cost there as well.
So thanks very much for that answer, Professor Craig. And we certainly took evidence from Natasha Cortis and her colleagues at UNSW with regard to the shift allocations and the research that she did for the SDA union. If I'm hearing you correctly, the much celebrated lift in Australian female entrepreneurship, in fact, might be a bit of a canary about the danger of the workplace for women trying to manage care and work. And they're simply leaving because there's no flexibility in either the workplace or the care access that they need to function as a full or part-time worker to match their talents and capacities.
That's right. They're taking the risk on themselves. They're being wedged from both sides, and it's not necessarily a good solution. I mean, it reflects the lack of collective responsibility for care in a way. If the reforms to childcare make it accessible and flexible and affordable and it's available, then I'm not sure that so many people would be taking that risk on themselves.
So perhaps data that revealed men in corporate structures where there is high level of security of work and reasonably high wages for some of the biggest companies, data that revealed the same level of exit to entrepreneurial small business activity by those people. If male and female data there was similarly matched, then we'd be reflecting a culture that was actually about entrepreneurship rather than I'm unable to cope with the demands of a workplace that simply doesn't match the reality of life.
Yes, I think there would be a small indicator of that in the amount of, if men generally go into are self-employed and employ others, it's sole trader. Obviously, some men are sole traders, but a high proportion of women are sole traders. And yes, we're not necessarily seeing a burgeoning entrepreneurship as much as people finding themselves in an unsustainable situation in the workforce.
So a desperate flight from work to work where you have some control.
Yeah.
Professor Preston, you had your hand up.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to quickly share a screen. I think I can just add a little bit information to this discussion that we're having right now. Okay. Hopefully you can see. Can you see anything?
Not yet.
Let's try again. Yep. Okay. So this is just a paper that I've been working on with a colleague. It's actually under review right now. Hopefully none of you are reviewing it, or I've just given away revealed who the authors are. But anyway, it's basically on working from home and who's been working from home using the HILDA data that during COVID. However, this diagram here, our focus in the paper is on employees, but this first chart here was just to look at what the difference was between employees and who reported as being self-employed. And so you can see, I lost my cursor here. You can see from this panel on the left-hand side, this is the incidence of people who usually spend some of the time working from home. So if you're self-employed and you're a female, around 70% of them have been spending at least some time at home, which would go to the point, I think, that we've just been discussing, that a lot of women who are self-employed are doing it for care-related reasons, although there is also a high share of males in that capacity. This isn't going to talk to the questions that have just been asked in terms of, the transition out of paid employment and into self-employment, but I thought it might just add to the discussion. And now I'm going to try and work out how to stop sharing my screen. I think I've done that. Okay, thank you.
Senator O'Neill, I'll also send through some published research by a colleague in the business school, Dr. Mariah Foley, whose PhD is on this very question. It was completed probably 5 years ago, but nevertheless, she did her project on mumpreneurs, identifying the stresses and inadequacies of wage employment and the way that led to a number of women deciding that the solution was to be self-employed, bear the risks themselves, and then the failure in that process and the self-employment not working out. So those same drivers that Professor Craig has been talking about, but then she has documented evidence on how that actually worked for them. And the intensification of work and care not being satisfactory and negative impacts on wellbeing. So I'll send that to the committee for your consideration.
I'm sure I won't be seeing the sad stories of that research in a glossy magazine on a Saturday morning telling me about how I can have it all.
No, they're the outliers.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator O'Neill. One of your questions, Senator O'Neill, really, I wondered if it was heading towards asking for a kind of hierarchy of most important reforms sort of listed off, but given fiscal constraints that are real. And what that made me think about is the way the committee may consider short-term, medium-term, longer-term aspirations in terms of policy. And I wondered if we could ask the committee to give that some thought, if possible, subsequent to this discussion, because some of the things we're talking about are very large reforms. And just on that front, I wanted to ask a question about childcare before going to you, Senator White, for any questions you may have. I'm very conscious we've got some people who've spent many decades studying early childhood education and care, and we have had a range of submissions from people on this question. We have a complex system of care. I wondered what your advice might be, whoever wants to take this, on key reforms in that system in the near future. Yesterday, a number of us were at a revenue summit where there was discussion about the privatisation of our care system, for example. Is there merit, and I want to go to the issue of quality care that's more universally available, perhaps less on the cost, because I think we've covered that. Is there a good argument for a larger public investment in direct childcare provision and planning? Senator Bragg has shown interest in this in previous hearings, where we layer over the top of an imperfect and very diverse system across our country an investment in centres in the places where we need them, in the high needs communities, so that we can lift provision of public care outside the profit system. Just what your thinking is about that. Is that clear enough? Deb, Brennan, it's probably your question.
Yeah, can I suggest Deb and then Wendy, and then Natasha, you may have a contribution you want to make. Deb.
Thanks, Senator Pocock. Yes, I've been sitting here thinking about exactly that issue, especially having regard to Senator O'Neill's question about fiscal constraints. And I would say that serious attention to the nature and the structure of Australia's early education and care system would be one of the most urgent focuses for policy review that I personally would recommend. I think the international evidence now is very compelling. We do know that there is excellent and high quality education and care in the for-profit and the not-for-profit. But I think looking across the world, I personally could not identify a single system based on for-profit provision that is delivering the types of outcomes that we are now seeking in Australia. That is equitable, quality provision at rates that are affordable, enabling parents to participate in the economy and society, but critically contributing to the development, flourishing of children. So I think that would be really one of the best things we could do. And we're seeing in a number of states, Australian states and states in particular, and territories, an effort to build on the public investment in education and public schools, extending that into the early education care sphere. I think that's a really welcome development. I think it's important not to present or perceive this as any kind of ideological crusade. It's simply an outcome of an exploration of the evidence. We need to spend every single dollar as effectively and efficiently as we can in all realms of government policy, but I'm speaking about early education and care. And my reading of the evidence is that in order to do that, we need to be looking at investing in supply of non-profit and public provision, and not simply at supporting parental demand through fee subsidies. So that would be my first comment, or my comment.
Thank you.
Professor Boyd.
Thank you. I just got promoted to professor. Ha.
That was easy.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak. And I totally endorse what Deb's saying about the need for a public, quality, affordable early childhood education and care system. And underpinning that, I think that we need to ensure that the workers, who are mostly female, in early childhood education and care have good work conditions. At the moment, early childhood educators are turning away from the system, and that was evident in the strike that was held early in September. And I think that comes as part of the parcel of what Deb's talking about. Early childhood educators, teachers in particular, who may well have the same qualification as a primary school teacher, are currently earning around 20% less in real terms compared to their primary school counterparts. And you're not going to attract people to work in the early childhood system without ensuring that the work conditions, well, you are going to, because some people are passionate about working with young children. However, we also need to ensure that the early childhood teachers are paid accordingly to what they deserve. Thanks.
Natasha?
Yeah. Thank you, and I would endorse all of that as well. And I would just want to add the importance of considering quality in developing early childhood policy and kind of making decisions about the appropriate role for public provision and public investment over private providers. And I have a recent article that I can provide to the committee. It's rather a book chapter on quality and marketised care, which takes advantage of the great quality data that we now have about early childhood education and care. It uses national quality standards and compares performance against those standards of public, private and non-profit family daycare providers. And it shows that as private providers have been able to gain a foothold in the market, standards of quality have fallen. And while it is about family daycare, which is, a much smaller sector of early childhood education and care than long daycare, I'd expect the same findings, or similar findings in relation to long daycare. So I can provide that to the committee if it's
And Meg, Professor Smith.
Oh, thank you, and thank you to the senators. I would just add to that point, we've spoken today about the interconnected nature of policy settings, and clearly appropriately paid work for paid carers in whether it's the early childhood and education sector or the aged care is reasonably pivotal to that. So the related policy setting here addresses the capacity of minimum rates awards to properly value the work, and there have been impediments to the proper valuation of paid care work in and of itself. And then additionally, the problems that have occurred with pay equity matters being addressed by way of the current legislative structure. So I can't stress enough the importance of minimum wage awards to this sector, in that there is limited bargaining that occurs. So minimum rates awards operate like paid rates awards for a significant proportion of the sector. The valuation of work is pivotal. Losing skilled workers because of the rates of pay is detracts from the investment that has been made through their education and their contribution to the sector. And then, of course, addressing the disparity in the valuation of work that's been unable to be remedied by pay equity applications to date. I would note the importance of those policy settings to addressing the questions that were raised by Senator O'Neill. Thank you.
Professor Smith, just as we go to Senator White, who may well bring her expertise in on this question as well, have you got any specific recommendations you would think would be useful to address the work value questions that are clearly endemic?
Yes, Senator Pocock, I certainly do. I think there needs to be a pay equity principle that is inclusive but also beyond specific equal remuneration claims as currently constituted, which have not been able to be addressed either by way of a specific provision or by way of the expert panel addressing minimum wages, or by way of modern award reviews. Now, noting that the capacity for 4-year reviews is changed now. But there hasn't been the capacity to address the valuation of work until most recently through the work value proceedings in the aged care award. So the capacity to address the valuation needs to be addressed by way of an appropriate principle that is inclusive of all industrial instruments as we would currently see them. It would also enable equal remuneration claims. It wouldn't require that comparators are a prerequisite to a claim of this sort, and it would overcome the difficulties that have prevented and been commented upon by the Fair Work Commission in addressing valuation of work matters in minimum wage determinations and modern award reviews. That's included Senator Pocock in the work and in the roundtable submission towards the conclusion of that, but I would be happy to provide further material as required.
Thank you, Professor Smith. Senator White.
Thanks. Well, having been involved in the comparators, I have to agree that's just an artificial craziness position to do. Like, I don't know, somebody made that up. I guess if you look at the comparators saying, well, it's just crazy. Like having run a case, it took 6 years to get that equal pay case up. 6 years, right? That's a long time. And finding the comparators, I agree with you, it's extraordinarily difficult. It seems extremely artificial. But then if I look at the comparators saying in childcare, let's look at local government who provides childcare, who pay, I don't know, something like 25% more for childcare workers than in the private sector. And for a similar, for the same job, which I guess goes to the point, I think, I'm sorry who made it, but the point about the intervention of the private sector in some of these vital services has an influence. It tends to drive wages down. Anyway, so that's not a question. That's a statement of what I'm thinking. I did have a question about grandparents. So what's in those statistics? I think it was sorry, who was it that spoke? Associate Professor Hamilton talked about grandparents. What's the age? Studies that you have been looking at. What is the age range of grandparents out of interest? And I know you talked about other people doing modelling potentially about what the worth of, or the 13-hour barrier that you talked about. But if you've got any sense of what the age range for grandparents is in the research that you're talking about, because you could be a grandparent at 40, at 40, for instance, and so the influence on your earning capacity at different stages. Not every grandparent's going to be 75, right? For instance, I just was interested in what, if any, statistics you have in relation to that.
Oh, thanks, Senator White. Yes, so the younger grandparents are more likely to be providing regular childcare for their grandchildren. So most of the regular childcare provision is done by people aged 55 to 64. And there are some younger grandparents and some older grandparents, but the large sort of bulk of that care is done by those kind of younger grandparents that are still of working age. And then the older they get, the more likely we see their involvement in grandparent childcare to be more occasional and less intensive. So, yes, it's really, the biggest group is really right in that part of the sort of more mature age workforce that we're trying to encourage to participate. I mean, when I say policy settings are trying to encourage them to participate in the labour market longer. And they're the ones that are also providing most of the regular childcare.
Thanks. And so what seems to be coming out is that there's a lot of levers and lots of different things. But would it be fair to say that if you had to summarise this in a paragraph, what we have is a system that is still based on women not participating in the workforce. This is generally like everything. And so, and that it is, and that so it's generally at that, so at all levels, tax levels, that family, the family payments, all those things. It's really not about participation. It's about assistance, but not really full-on work participation. And similarly, the other overlay, I guess, is that the way in which early childhood education is characterised has gone from childminding to a vital part of a child's education. Discuss. There you go. That's what it seems to be the theme that is coming out, that the system is struggling because it's got this premise of what work is, and we are now got a crisis of participation, which means you've got to relook at absolutely everything, but the fundamentals of how the systems have been designed have got a different premise. Or am I missing something?
I think, Senator White, your characterisation is clear and correct. We have an approach to work and care that is quite residual, and it centres work. And so it centres work for men, and care gets kind of packed around that. And so as women have entered the labour market, there's been some acknowledgement, but not an adequate acknowledgement of who then is going to do the unpaid care work. So the system is at a real crunch point, because official policy is about increasing women's workforce participation, but the policy settings provide incentives that run diametrically against that. So this is where the crunch comes, and it's causing havoc in households. You've got, and we find definitely in our qualitative research, younger workers, the under 40s, are just gobsmacked. Women have been told to invest in their human capital. They've gone out, they've done it in spades. They're brilliant. They've started careers, and as soon as they hit that kind of first child, they and often their partner are like, what the heck is going on here? And getting back to Professor Stewart's effective marginal tax rates, and there's a lot of worry about how then to patch it together. And so turning to grandparents, turning to all kinds of, taking a very kind of piecemeal and patchwork approach that then has to be revisited, year on year or 6 months on 6 months as children change. So there's no security of provision. It's not just about childcare, it's also about paid parental leave being a really important piece of that kind of smooth run into an intensive period of work and care, and managing that in a way that doesn't disadvantage either party in a family. So your interpretation of where we're at is correct, and your understanding of the multiple levers is also correct. There is actually a lot we can do. There's a lot of levers that can be pulled to change the incentives and to smooth the process. That's certainly the findings of all the kind of research expertise around the Work and Family Policy Roundtable. So yes, Alison, you were going to make a contribution.
Thank you. I would just like to share another picture, if that's okay with the group. Here we go again. I think I'm getting better at this. Share. It's not too dissimilar to the image that was shared earlier on by Professor Stewart. It really just reinforces, I think, the work. I don't know what Patricia Apps has been doing recently, but obviously we know that she does fantastic work. Again, this is just using Australian Bureau of Statistics data. The part that I really want to point out on this one that I just find absolutely staggering is what we're showing here is all those people who are now in employment. So we saw previously that there's been a big shift up in participation in employment by women. There's been a flattening out of that, partly because women are delaying childbirth, partly because they're having fewer children. But this diagram here is looking at, of those who are now in employment, what proportion are working full time. And the part that I think is just gobsmacking is that, so maybe that's not the word I should be using, staggering, significant, is that there's been very little change in the pattern over the 30 years that we're looking at here. So the dotted blue line for women is 1990, the yellow line is 2019, and there's been very little change in that pattern. So we're getting women into the labour market, but we're not changing how they participate in the labour market, and that's all about care. And so again, it just talks to, I think, the points that we've been making right now, but that the fact that there's been very little change in that in 30 years, I find staggering.
Can I just ask on that graph, is there a graph for, is there something like that for other countries that show a different?
I'm sure there are. I don't have one to hand, but these wouldn't be difficult graphs to produce if given access.
I think that would
to
be
the
really,
data.
it would be really interesting just to kind of go, well, but actually this is not worldwide. Other people have done this. Sorry.
Big contrast with the Nordic countries, and we'll ask the Parliamentary Library to produce a comparator. Thanks, Senator White. Who was next?
Professor Cass, Brennan and Craig. And Kate, did you have your hand up? Okay, I might, Bettina, would you mind if we go to Kate first?
Not at all.
Kate.
Thanks, Liz. I just wanted to add that something we haven't talked about yet is the fact that the pandemic and made them really clear to all of us. So if we're looking to evidence, we can find some really recent evidence that shows that the policy inadequacies mean that women are too often the safety net. So women, as Lynn Craig's research showed, did end up intensifying their domestic labour contribution. As research in academia shows, women up actually withdrawing their workforce participation, not contributing as they might want to, but it also showed the significance of flexible work and how flexible work enables us to do things differently, and how universal childcare also enables us to do things differently, as well as the pertinence of care workers and how they are indeed essential but undervalued and underpaid. Thanks.
I think Professor Cass was next.
Thank you. I'd like to add to the conversation briefly, because I know it's towards the end, the key importance of family and friend care, which impacts particularly upon women, but we have data in our submission which shows that both male and female carers, family and friend carers of frail, sick and people with disabilities have considerably lower labour force participation rates than those who don't have caring responsibilities. And this impacts women, particularly in the area of full-time labour force participation. So we need to ensure that when we're deeply concerned with maintaining the labour force participation rates through adult life, that we don't forget that there are several dips, and there's particularly another dip in participation when the care of older family members, of a frail sick spouse, of continuing care of an offspring with disability keeps on impacting labour force participation. And absolutely clear that Australia does not have, compared with the Nordic countries and some of the Western European countries, is not respite care, which is not about maintaining labour force participation. It is what it says, respite care, but forms of alternate care and real investment in home-based alternate care that, and of course, maintaining and the wages and conditions of the paid care workers who are doing that work, which is absolutely vital in maintaining labour force participation rates through working life. If we look only at the dip in the period of family formation, we're missing a large and growing part of the care necessities of the care infrastructure as well as the paid care workforce. And I hope your committee will attend to that very carefully.
Thank you, Bettina. And Professor Craig.
Yes, I was just going to say that Australia is quite an outlier in the amount of reliance on female care. The assumption that unpaid care is going to be available over the life course, as Bettina says, most extreme evidence that when the children are young, but throughout the life course, and we're really much lower on workforce participation than almost any other comparable nation. And of a piece with very traditional countries like Italy or the Asian countries is closer, and it really reflects how much the institutional settings, the structures, are disincentivizing women and hemming them in from the choices, and they and their partners and everyone would like to be making. They're being channeled into areas that are not working out for them or really for the nation. So just a simple point to say, yes, Australia is unusual in this regard.
Can I ask a follow-up question there, Senator Craig? Are there any I know your work shows how unchanging, is that fair to say, the domestic allocations are of unpaid work between men and women? Are there any recommendations that the committee could consider on that really sort of intractable background structural problem of gender roles and unpaid work?
Well, I think the gender roles would shift along with attitudes more readily when some of the structural things were changed. If the what Professor Stewart was talking about with the making it so expensive to stay longer and use childcare for longer, if it was publicly provided, easily accessible childcare would mean that people could choose how to divide their work and care within households with much fewer constraints. I don't think it'll solve the problem entirely. I think there would need to be workplace changes too, to do with male work patterns and how those work out. But changing some of the levers that we've discussed today would mean that there would be more choice about people following what they would wish to do, and then we'd be able to attend more closely to the residual problem of within household divisions of labour, which are intractable, but we're not on a level playing field here. So yes, the doing things within households, it's difficult for policy intervention there, but there's a lot of public measures that could be taken that could take things out of people's way.
Senator Pocock, just to add to that, maybe this is what Myra was going to say. There are examples from, for example, Iceland and their paid parental leave system that shows that public policy that provides, 3 months for one parent, 3 months for the other parent, and 3 months to be shared, actually has shifted the gender division of labour, of unpaid labour in the household, and that shift then tracks over time. So there is examples of where public policy can actually drive behavioural change within the household. Myra, was that what you were going to say?
It is, that's right. I was going to say, I think in Australia at the moment, with settings as they are, that's the easiest policy lever that we have is the parental leave scheme, and the potential to create a considerably longer period that is earmarked for fathers and partners, long enough for it to really change behaviour in an ongoing way, because as Liz said, in some of the Nordic countries, there's evidence that getting fathers involved in childcare as the primary provider of childcare, not the short periods of secondary care that we care leave that we tend to focus on here at the moment in Australia, getting them involved in primary care of their children for much longer periods early in the child's life has long-standing impacts on the division of labour.
And this is where I think the committee needs to consider the aspirations of young Australian men. Our qualitative data shows very clearly that there's an increasing feeling an expectation amongst young Australian men that they want to do and participate in the unpaid care of their children. And they're disappointed and shocked by the policy settings that disincentivize that and make it a much more rational response of their household to for that work to be done by the birth partner. So it's, you know, we need to make these changes for young Australian men as much as we need to make them for young Australian women.
And sorry, Senator Boyd.
I need
Boyd.
to go. I'm sorry. Thank you. It's been a really...
Thank you for your contribution. And on
Thank
that,
you.
I think we've promised to end around about now. And I want to thank all of you on behalf of all the senators who are here today for your contributions. And I want to acknowledge the incredible practical research findings that you've put before us and your undertakings around providing further material, perhaps pointing to directions that we need to take, including perhaps on paid parental leave. We haven't gone to the overall quantum of leave and also, of course, superannuation. But I understand we've got views from you on that. So I thank you very much, not just for your appearance today and for your submission, but also for the body of work that you are providing to the Australian public and the Senate that underpins a number of issues that we will be dealing with. So that concludes today's hearing, and thank you, everyone who's been here. And I remind you that the committee set a deadline on responses to questions on notice. We'd really love to hear anything that you've undertaken to provide to us within 2 weeks, if possible, to the Secretariat. That's the 21st of October. But I do want to say to you, you've given us some very up-to-date information, and clearly you're collecting stuff that we are very interested in as we speak. If there is further material, please don't hesitate to contact the Secretariat and supply it to us. We will be very keen to receive it. Thank you to Broadcasting and to Hansard for your assistance, and also to the very hard-working committee secretariat we have. The committee stands adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Pocock.
Everyone.